There is a road in the outback of Queensland that runs so straight and so flat for so long that drivers have been known to fall asleep behind the wheel simply from the monotony of it. The sky above it at night is so dark and so full of stars that people who have grown up under city lights will pull over and just stand there for a while, looking up, not quite believing what they are seeing. The land on either side of that road is called the Channel Country. It is one of the most remote inhabited places on the surface of the earth. There are no towns for a very long time in any direction. There is spinifex grass and red clay and the occasional dry creek bed and nothing else as far as you can see, which in the daytime is very far indeed. People have been driving that road for about 100 years now. Before that, people on horseback were riding it. Before that, Aboriginal Australians were walking it on routes they had known for tens of thousands of years. And for at least a century of documented record, and considerably longer in oral tradition, people traveling through that country have reported seeing something they cannot explain. A light. Round and luminous, floating above the ground at roughly head height, sometimes the size of a football, sometimes larger. Pale white in some accounts, golden in others, a soft blue-green in a handful of cases, moving through the darkness at a steady, unhurried pace, and in the cases that make people go quiet when they describe them, following, moving when the observer moves, stopping when they stop, tracking a car down a highway for 40 kilometers without closing the gap and without falling behind. This is not a fringe phenomenon. It is not something that only one or two people have reported. The Australian government commissioned a scientific study of it. A Queensland University academic drove into the outback with scientific equipment to investigate it. Prominent naturalists, cattle station managers, stockmen, long-haul truck drivers, military pilots, families on road trips, and Aboriginal elders with knowledge stretching back thousands of years have all described the same thing. The phenomenon even has a name, borrowed from a hotel that burned down in 1918 in a tiny outback town called Boulia. They are called the Min Min lights. And nobody, not the atmospheric scientists, not the geologists, not the physicists, not the biologists, has been able to fully explain what they are, why they track people, why they appear infrared weighted in the rare photographic evidence, or why the Aboriginal people of the region have held consistent and detailed knowledge about them for as long as their oral tradition reaches. Tonight, we are going to go through 20 accounts and 20 pieces of this puzzle. We are going to walk through the history of the Min Min lights from the very beginning. We are going to look at what science has managed to explain and what it has not. We are going to spend time with the people who saw them, the drover riding at night, the family in the station wagon, the scientist with his equipment, the woman who tried to photograph them on 12 separate occasions. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, you are going to find yourself wondering about a stretch of dark road and a pale light floating at head height, moving at exactly the speed you are moving, watching you cross the interior of a continent that has been home to those lights for longer than anyone alive can remember. Get comfortable. There is no rush here. We have the whole night. Number 1. The hotel that burned to the ground. Before there were Min Min lights, there was the Min Min Hotel. And before we can understand why this matters, you need to understand what an outback Queensland pub was like in 1918. Boulia is a small town in western Queensland, roughly 300 kilometers south of Mount Isa. In 1918, it was even smaller than it is now, which is already very small indeed. The population of the entire surrounding region was measured in dozens, not hundreds. The people who lived there were cattle station workers, stockmen, a handful of local government employees, and Aboriginal people whose connection to the land predated European settlement by an unimaginable margin. The country around Boulia is flat, dry, and enormous. It is the kind of place where the nearest doctor is a day's ride away, where mail comes infrequently, and where the pub is one of the few places that gives a long, isolated journey a destination. The Min Min Hotel sat roughly 100 kilometers east of Boulia, at a location called Min Min, which was a watering stop on the stock route. In 1918, that hotel burned to the ground. The exact cause of the fire is not recorded with any great precision in the surviving accounts. What is recorded is that afterward, travelers passing through that stretch of road began reporting a light. The earliest written report attributed to what would become known as the Min Min phenomenon dates to shortly after the hotel fire. A stockman traveling the road at night reported seeing a luminous glow hovering over the ruins of the hotel. He described it as a ball of light, roughly the size of a cartwheel, floating a meter or two above the ground, pale and soft and faintly moving. He watched it for several minutes, then it drifted away into the darkness. This account is important not because it is the most dramatic or the most puzzling, but because it is the origin point of the name. The connection to the hotel ruins gave the lights their identity in the European-Australian storytelling tradition. They became the Min Min lights, named for the place where people first started writing them down. But here's the thing. The Aboriginal people of the region, the Wangkongaroo and other groups whose country this was, had names and stories for these lights that predated the hotel by an unknowable number of generations. The lights did not begin with the hotel fire. The hotel fire simply gave European settlers a convenient local anchor for something they had been seeing and hearing about and quietly fearing ever since they arrived in that country. What the burning of the Min Min Hotel actually did was this. It created a landmark in a landscape that has very few landmarks. It gave something that was already happening a fixed address. And it gave the phenomenon a name that would eventually make it into scientific literature, government reports, and the collected testimony of hundreds of people across more than a century. The ruins of the Min Min Hotel are long gone now. The site is marked by a roadside plaque, and the lights, by all available evidence, continue. Number 2. The drover who chased the light for 40 kilometers. The account that most researchers treat as the defining early record of Min Min encounter behavior comes from a stockman and drover named Rankin, who was camped in the Channel Country in 1942. The year is significant. Australia was at war. Resources were stretched. The interior of Queensland was still deeply isolated. The roads were poor, and a man camped alone in the outback with a mob of cattle was in a situation that was not unusual for the time and place, but would be considered extraordinary by most people today. Rankin was lying in his swag one night when he noticed a light approaching from the east. He described it as a soft, round glow, pale white, about the size of a large lantern flame, but without any visible flame. It was floating above the ground at roughly head height, perhaps 1.5 meters off the clay. It was moving at a slow, steady pace. Not fast, not erratic, just traveling. He watched it for a while, lying still. The light passed through his camp without stopping and continued west. And then Rankin did something that very few people who encounter these lights subsequently choose to do. He decided to follow it. He saddled his horse. In the dark, in the middle of the Queensland outback, in 1942, he rode after the light. For approximately 40 kilometers, the light stayed ahead of him. Not far ahead, not so far that he lost sight of it, just enough ahead that he could not close the gap. He pushed his horse harder. The light maintained its distance. He slowed. The light slowed. He stopped. The light stopped. He described it as though the light was aware of him, as though it was playing with the gap between them with deliberate precision, not fleeing, not approaching, just maintaining a fixed and comfortable distance, moving when he moved, pausing when he paused, always there, and always just out of reach. After 40 kilometers, the light disappeared. It did not slowly fade, it did not move off to the horizon. It simply went out, the way a lamp goes out when someone blows the flame. And Rankin was alone in the dark, 40 kilometers from his camp, on a horse he had ridden hard through the night. He turned around and rode back. This account matters because it is one of the earliest detailed descriptions of what would become the most significant and most puzzling behavioral feature of the Min Min lights: the tracking. The tendency of the lights to maintain a specific relationship with an observer, to match speed, to mirror movement, to create the persistent impression, experienced by dozens of witnesses across decades, that whatever these lights are, they are aware that they are being watched. No physical phenomenon that science has confidently identified behaves this way. Light from a distant source maintains the appearance of following you because the source is far enough away that your movement does not significantly change your angle to it. This is the explanation given for why the moon appears to follow your car. But the lights described by Rankin and the many witnesses who came after him are not described as being on the horizon. They are described as being close enough to throw a faint illumination on the ground, close enough to be clearly round and clearly defined and clearly moving in direct response to the observer's movement. 40 kilometers, on horseback, in the dark, and never once did the gap change. Number 3. The night a family was followed for 3 hours. In 1967, a family by the name of McIntosh was driving south along the Birdsville Track. If you are not familiar with the Birdsville Track, it is one of those Australian roads that has its own reputation independent of any destination it connects. It runs roughly 500 kilometers between Maree in South Australia and Birdsville in Queensland, a cross-country that is, to put it plainly, not forgiving. In the 1960s, it was worse than it is now. No sealed surface, no lighting, no phone communication, just 2 tire ruts through red sand and gibber plain, and the kind of silence that makes people from cities very uncomfortable very quickly. The McIntosh family was making the crossing in the evening hours. There were multiple adults and at least 1 child in the car. This is important because one of the persistent challenges in evaluating Min accounts is the question of corroboration. Whether what was seen by only 1 person, which allows for the possibility of fatigue or optical illusion, or whether it was seen simultaneously by multiple independent witnesses. This family saw the light together. All of the adults in the vehicle saw it at the same time. A round, pale glow appearing out of the darkness to the east, floating above the flat ground at roughly the height of a person's head, moving parallel to the road, matching the car's speed. For 3 hours, the McIntosh family drove the Birdsville Track with a light floating alongside their vehicle. They tried stopping. The light stopped. They tried accelerating. The light accelerated. They tried turning off their headlights so that, if the light was some form of reflection from their vehicle, it would disappear. It did not disappear. They tried approaching it by pulling off the track and driving toward where it floated. As the car turned toward it, the light moved away, maintaining the distance between them with the same precise indifference that Rankin had described on horseback 25 years earlier. 3 hours is a very long time to watch something you cannot explain. Long enough for the initial shock to wear off and be replaced by something that several witnesses to extended Min encounters describe as a specific kind of unease. Not the sharp fear of sudden surprise, but the slow, grinding discomfort of prolonged exposure to something that does not obey the rules. They could not get closer to it. They could not drive away from it. They could only move alongside it, watched by it or watching it, crossing the flat, dark country in a relationship they had not asked for and could not end. The light eventually disappeared somewhere in the small hours of the morning. The family drove on. When they arrived at their destination and described what had happened, they found that other travelers on the Birdsville Track had described similar experiences. This is a consistent feature of Min testimony. The sense that what seemed unique and terrifying is, in that particular part of the world, almost commonplace, almost expected, as though the lights are simply part of the landscape, like the heat and the silence and the red dust. And the only unusual thing is that not everyone knows about them yet. Number 4. The stockman who saw 2 lights having a conversation. Not all Min encounters involve a single light. There is a category of account that is less commonly discussed, but appears consistently enough in the record to deserve its own space, and that is the encounter with multiple lights. Lights that appear to interact with each other. Lights that move relative to each other as well as relative to the observer, as though whatever is generating them is not a single source, but a system of some kind. In 1958, a stockman camped near the Georgina River in western Queensland reported an encounter that remained in the regional oral tradition for years afterward. He was alone, which is not unusual for a working stockman in that country. He had made camp at dusk, eaten, and was lying in his swag watching the sky when he became aware of a light to the north of his camp. He watched it, as people do. It was the standard description: round, floating, head height, pale. He lay still and observed it for perhaps 5 minutes, during which it drifted slowly closer to his camp without closing completely, maintaining what he described as a respectful distance. And then, to the east, a second light appeared. He watched the 2 lights for the better part of an hour, and what he described in his account was not simply 2 lights existing independently near each other. He described movement between them. The lights would drift closer together, then apart. One would remain stationary while the other circled slowly around it. At one point, they were separated by perhaps 30 meters, and then, over the course of several minutes, closed that gap to perhaps 10. He could not, of course, hear anything. There was no sound associated with the lights at all, which is a feature common to virtually every Min account on record. Perfect silence. He described it, in the language of a man who worked outdoors and had no patience for dramatic expression, as looking like two dogs trying to work out whether they were friends. This account matters for a specific reason. If the Min lights were an atmospheric optical phenomenon, a mirage or a refraction effect, you would expect them to behave in ways consistent with that explanation. You would not expect two separately sourced refraction effects to drift toward each other, circle, and then approach. Mirage images do not interact. Light from two distant sources does not converge and then separate again in the kind of deliberate, exploratory way that this stockman described. What he saw that night, whatever it was either two independent phenomena coincidentally appearing at the same time and moving in ways that mimicked intentional interaction, or it was something that does not fit comfortably into any of the categories that available science currently offers us. He broke camp before dawn and moved on. He did not approach the lights. In that country, among the people who have spent the most time in it, not approaching the Min lights is something close to an unspoken rule. Number 5. What the Wangkanguru people have always known. The Aboriginal people of the Channel Country and the broader arid interior of Australia have lived in relationship with this landscape for somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years. That is not a figure I want to pass over too quickly, because I think it is easy to read that number and let it slide by without really landing. 50,000 years. Agriculture as a global human practice is roughly 10,000 years old. The wheel is approximately 6,000 years old. Writing is around 5,000 years old. The Aboriginal occupation of Australia is older than all of those things by a very significant margin, and it has been continuous. The same country, the same knowledge systems, generation after generation after generation, maintaining a relationship with a landscape that most of the world does not know exists. The Wangkanguru people, whose country includes the Channel Country, where Min encounters are most concentrated, have knowledge of the lights that is woven into their understanding of the land itself. They are not, in the Wangkanguru tradition, primarily a mystery to be solved. They are a feature of the country, like the water holes and the song lines and the seasonal behavior of animals. They have a place in the knowledge system. They have a meaning. They have protocols. The core of that protocol, shared by multiple Aboriginal groups across the regions where Min encounters occur, is do not pursue, do not follow the lights, do not chase them, do not try to close the distance. The reasons given in different traditions vary in their specifics, but share a common structure. The lights are associated with the spirits of the dead, or they are entities of the landscape itself, neither benign nor malicious, but possessed of a purpose that is their own and not yours. Approaching them is understood as a form of transgression, not necessarily in the sense of a rule violation, but in the deeper sense of misreading what kind of encounter this is. The light is not an invitation. It is not a guide. It is not yours to approach. When Stockman Rankin chased a Min light for 40 kilometers on horseback in 1942, he was doing the thing that the people who have known this country for 50,000 years specifically advise against. That he came to no apparent harm is probably a comfort. That he never closed the gap across 40 kilometers of riding is, from the Wangkanguru perspective, perhaps not surprising. The consistency of Aboriginal knowledge about the Min lights across multiple groups and multiple centuries of European contact is scientifically significant for a specific reason. Oral traditions can preserve accurate environmental knowledge across very long timescales. There is strong evidence that Aboriginal oral traditions contain accurate information about geological events thousands of years in the past: volcanic eruptions, sea level changes, the disappearance of megafauna. If the Min lights are a natural phenomenon of the landscape, it would be remarkable if the people who have lived in that landscape for 50,000 years did not have detailed knowledge of them. And they do. What they know is, the lights are real, they have a consistent behavior, they are not to be chased, and they have been there since before anyone alive can remember. Number 6. The Brown Mountain Lights of New South Wales. The Min Min region of Queensland does not have a monopoly on Australian orb phenomena. About 1,500 kilometers to the southeast, in the ranges south of Braidwood in New South Wales, there is a place called Brown Mountain. And Brown Mountain has its own lights. The Braidwood district is not outback. It is forested, green in the wet season, cold in winter, a different landscape entirely from the flat red clay of the Channel Country. European settlers began arriving in the area in the 1830s, and within a generation of that arrival, accounts of lights moving through the forest at Brown Mountain were already part of the local record. The Brown Mountain lights share several features with the Min Min phenomenon. They are round, they are luminous, they move. They appear most often at night, though there are accounts of pale daytime sightings. They have been seen by multiple witnesses at the same time. They have been documented by people with no particular interest in the paranormal, whose accounts appear in local newspapers and regional histories dating back to the 19th century. A family named Radford, who farmed in the area for 3 generations, gave multiple accounts across different decades. The grandmother first described the lights in the 1890s. Her son described seeing them in the 1920s. Her grandchildren reported encounters in the 1950s. This multi-generational consistency is one of the features of the Brown Mountain record that distinguishes it from isolated anomalous sightings. This is not one person in one night describing something strange. This is a family documenting the same phenomenon across 60 years of living in the same place. The Brown Mountain lights have attracted investigators over the years, including a team from the University of New England in the 1990s who spent several nights on the mountain with cameras and recording equipment. They managed to photograph something, a pale, round light moving through the tree line. The photographs are not dramatic. They are blurry, as most nocturnal field photographs tend to be. But they show something there that should not be there, and they show it in approximately the location and with approximately the appearance that local witnesses had been describing for 150 years. Brown Mountain matters to the Min Min story for a reason that goes beyond regional interest. If the phenomenon were confined to the outback, if it required flat terrain and Channel Country geology and the specific atmospheric conditions of Western Queensland, then it would be easier to contain within a single explanatory framework. But the lights appear in forested mountain country in New South Wales too, and they appear on the Kimberley coast in Western Australia, and they appear in the Nullarbor, and they appear in the ranges south of Alice Springs. They appear in dramatically different landscapes with dramatically different geologies and dramatically different atmospheric conditions. And they look, in all of those places, essentially the same. Number 7. The Kimberley coast and the lights that match the rock art. The Kimberley region of northwestern Western Australia is one of the most geologically ancient places on Earth. The rocks there are among the oldest exposed rock formations on the planet. The landscape is dramatic in a way that Channel Country is not. Steep gorges, seasonal rivers that flood violently, red sandstone ranges, and a coast that is one of the most spectacular and least visited in Australia. The Kimberley is also one of the richest sites for Aboriginal rock art, with images dating back in some cases to roughly 50,000 years before the present. Some of that rock art depicts round, glowing forms floating above the ground. This observation requires care. Archaeological interpretation of ancient imagery is not straightforward, and claiming that a rock painting from 50,000 years ago definitively depicts the Min Min lights involves a level of certainty that the evidence does not entirely support. What can be said is this. Several panels of Kimberley rock art include images of round, luminous forms, positioned in ways that suggest they are floating above the landscape, distinct from the sun and moon imagery found elsewhere in the same sites. And these images appear in country where Min Min-style encounters are documented in the historical and contemporary record. The Kimberley lights have an additional feature that has attracted specific attention from researchers interested in the physical characteristics of the phenomenon. They appear to correlate with tidal activity. Multiple accounts from fishing communities along the Kimberley coast describe lights appearing most frequently in the hours around low tide, particularly during the large tidal ranges that the Kimberley coast is famous for. The tidal range in parts of the Kimberley reaches 11 meters. That is an enormous volume of water moving across a geologically complex and electrically active seabed twice every day. The significance of a tidal correlation, if it is real and if it holds up to rigorous examination, is this. It would be consistent with an explanation involving geological or piezoelectric activity, the generation of electrical phenomena through the compression or movement of certain rock types. The Kimberley geology includes significant quantities of quartz and other piezoelectric minerals. A tidal cycle that systematically compresses and releases those rock formations might, in principle, generate the kind of sustained electrical phenomena that could produce a floating, luminous ball. The rock art in the Kimberley is also significant in the same way that the Wangkanguru oral tradition is significant. If people living in this landscape 50,000 years ago thought it worth documenting glowing round forms floating above the ground, that is a very long testimony. Whatever is generating these lights, it has been generating them for long enough to become part of the artistic record of one of the longest continuous cultures in human history. Number 8. The war years and the pilots. The Second World War brought unusual things to the Australian interior. Military logistics operations, transport routes across the continent, air traffic over landscapes that had rarely seen aircraft. And it brought, in the testimony of at least several military pilots operating transport routes across inland Queensland and the Northern Territory, encounters with Min-Min-style lights from the air. The accounts from the 1943 and 1944 period are not numerous. Military pilots of that era were not generally encouraged to report anomalous sightings, for reasons related to operational security and the understandable institutional preference for not having your aircrew describe mystery lights following their aircraft over the Australian outback. But a handful of accounts survived in personal letters and post-war reminiscence. The general pattern was this. Transport pilots flying night routes across inland Queensland reported seeing pale, round lights below their aircraft, moving along the ground or at low altitude, at speeds inconsistent with any vehicle they could identify. The roads in that country in the 1940s were not suitable for high-speed travel. There were no headlights moving at 60 kilometers per hour across the Channel Country. And yet, lights moving at something approximating road speed along routes that did not correspond to any known track were described by at least 3 separate aircrew in accounts that emerged after the war ended. One pilot described circling back to get a second look at a light he had spotted during a night crossing, and finding that by the time he had brought the aircraft around, the light had moved several kilometers in a direction inconsistent with wind drift. Another described a light that appeared to track his aircraft for approximately 12 minutes before disappearing. The aerial perspective is valuable for a specific reason. One of the common explanations offered for ground-level Min-Min encounters is that the witness is simply misjudging distance and what they are seeing is a distant light source, a vehicle on a road far away, a campfire, a homestead light, that appears to float due to atmospheric refraction. This explanation has merit for certain accounts, but it becomes considerably harder to apply when the witness is in an aircraft flying at altitude over uninhabited country, and the light they are describing is clearly below them, moving independently and behaving in ways inconsistent with a stationary or vehicle-borne source. The pilot saw something. Whatever it was generating its own light, moving under its own energy, in country where there should have been nothing generating light at all. Number 9. The Nullarbor Crossings. The Nullarbor Plain is the flat limestone plateau that runs across the southern edge of Australia, connecting Western Australia to South Australia. It is named from the Latin for no trees, which is accurate. It is approximately 200,000 square kilometers of essentially featureless terrain, mostly between 200 and 300 meters above sea level, with a limestone surface that has not significantly changed since it was lifted from the sea approximately 14 million years ago. The Nullarbor is where the world's longest straight stretch of railway runs, 478 kilometers without a curve. The air highway crosses it in a similarly uncompromising manner. Long-haul truck drivers crossing the Nullarbor at night are one of the best documented witness categories for Australian orb phenomena. The reasons are practical. They are on the road for many hours, they are alone, they are alert, and they have no particular motivation to fabricate or embellish experiences that would, in their professional context, simply be embarrassing. Several trucking companies operating on the transcontinental route have internal records of drivers reporting anomalous lights, most of which were not pursued with any great vigor by management, but which exist in the paper trail of a working industry. A driver referred to in the literature as Vince, a pseudonym used by the researcher who collected his account in the 1980s, described an encounter on the Nullarbor that lasted approximately 4 hours. He had crossed the plain many times without incident. On this occasion, a light appeared alongside his truck approximately 150 kilometers east of Seduna and remained with him until he approached the town itself. His description of the light is standard for Min accounts: round, pale, floating at truck cab height, moving at his speed. What is distinctive about his account is the emotional texture of it. He described the experience as, in his words, not frightening after the first few minutes. He said it felt companionable. He said that after an hour, he had stopped trying to explain it and had simply driven with it alongside him, the way you drive with a radio on, not focused on it, just aware of it, a presence in the dark that made the crossing feel less solitary. That word, companionable, appears in enough Min accounts from long-haul drivers and solo travelers that it has been noted by researchers. Not all experiences with these lights are marked by fear. Some are marked by something closer to accompaniment, as though the light is not following the traveler in a threatening sense, but in the sense of a companion on a long road, someone keeping pace, someone aware that you are out there in the dark and choosing, for whatever reason, to travel alongside you for a while. Vince never reported a threatening gesture from the light. It did not approach, it did not accelerate. When he reached Seduna and the lights of the town became visible, it simply went out. He drove on. He filed no report. He told the researcher about it 20 years later in a pub over a beer. Number 10. The station manager who tried to photograph them. There is a person in the Min research record identified as Harriet, a cattle station manager in western Queensland who, over the course of roughly 15 years, made 12 separate attempts to photograph the lights she had seen on her property and on the roads around it. Her story is among the most scientifically interesting in the record because of what her photographs showed and what they did not show. Harriet first encountered the lights in the late 1970s on the track that led from the homestead to the main road. She described a standard encounter: round, floating, maintaining distance, disappearing without fading when she moved toward it. Her reaction was not fear, but what she described as enormous frustration. She wanted an explanation. She was a practical person with a practical job, and the presence of something that did not obey the rules of the landscape she managed was, to her, professionally irritating. She began photographing the lights. 12 attempts over 15 years. She used different cameras, different film stocks, different settings. She photographed from inside the homestead with the lights clearly visible through the window. She photographed from the back of a truck with the lights floating 50 meters away. She photographed from the dark with a telephoto lens on a night that the lights came closer than usual to the homestead. The results were consistent across all 12 attempts. On film, the lights either did not appear at all, appearing as a dark or empty patch in the frame where the light had been clearly visible to the naked eye, or they appeared as a faint, blurred anomaly at the edge of the frame, rather than in the area of the frame where they had been centered to the eye. This is not a case of a camera failing to capture something that was there. Harriet confirmed the lights were present at the time of exposure by having other people present on several occasions, who confirmed both that the lights were visible and that the photographs did not capture them accurately. The lights that were clearly visible to the human eye were either absent from or spatially misrepresented on the photographic film. This behavior, visibility to the eye, absence or displacement on film, is one of the most puzzling technical features of Min accounts. Subsequent analysis by people with an interest in photography and optics has suggested two possible explanations. First, that the lights may be weighted toward the near-infrared end of the spectrum, which would make them clearly visible to the human eye, which has some near-IR sensitivity, while being less effectively captured by standard photographic films calibrated for visible light. Second, that the lights may generate a form of radiation that interacts with photographic emulsions in ways that do not correspond to the simple point source image you would expect from a visible light source. Neither of these explanations is fully satisfying. Neither explains the spatial displacement, the lights appearing at the edge of the frame rather than where they were aimed. but the near-infrared hypothesis is at least consistent with subsequent measurements made by researchers who did manage to record the lights with specialized equipment, which we will come to later in this account. Harriet continued photographing the lights until she sold the station and moved to the coast. She took her photographs with her. They remain, as far as is known, unpublished. Number 11. 3 separate groups saw the same light. In August of 1979, on a stretch of road in western Queensland, not far from the original Min Min Hotel site, 3 separate groups of travelers reported encountering a Min Min light on the same night. What makes this significant is not merely the number of witnesses, though multiple simultaneous witnesses are always scientifically valuable, but the fact that the 3 groups were at different locations along the same road at different times during the same night, and their reports of the light's behavior are geometrically consistent with each other. A research team examining the accounts in the early 1980s noted that if you mapped the position and movement of the light as described by each of the 3 groups and their respective times of observation, the light's path was coherent. The light described by the first group traveling north was in a position consistent with it later being seen by the second group, who were traveling south from a different starting point. The third group, who had pulled off the road to camp, described the light moving in a direction consistent with both of the other accounts. The paths triangulate. This is the kind of evidence that, in a scientific context, carries real weight. It is easy to dismiss a single witness. It is harder to dismiss 3, and harder still when the 3 independent accounts are geometrically consistent with a single moving object traveling a coherent path across a landscape over the course of a night. The researchers also noted something about the light's behavior specific to this documented night. Each of the 3 groups had independently described the light as maintaining a consistent height above the ground, approximately 1.5 meters, regardless of the terrain. The road in that area is not perfectly flat. There are small rises and depressions, drainage channels, the slight undulations of a landscape that has seen millions of years of weather. A light from a fixed source reflecting off the atmosphere would not maintain a precise height above undulating ground. It would appear to rise and fall with the horizon. The light described by all 3 groups on that August night maintained its height above the actual ground, not above the apparent horizon. This is a detail that matters. A light that floats 1.5 meters above the ground while the ground undulates beneath it is doing something active, not passive. It is responding to the terrain. It is, in whatever sense the physics allow for, aware of what is below it. Number 12. The scientist who drove into the outback. In 2003, a Queensland University neurobiologist and visual perception researcher named Jack Pettigrew published a paper that represented the most rigorous scientific engagement with the Min Min phenomenon that had appeared in the literature to that point. Pettigrew did not sit in his office and theorize. He drove into the outback. He talked to witnesses. He took equipment. He collected data. And he proposed an explanation. Pettigrew's explanation was what is known as a fata morgana mirage. A fata morgana is a complex form of superior mirage that occurs when layers of air at different temperatures create a refracting lens in the atmosphere. In the right conditions, a fata morgana can cause images of objects below the horizon to appear above it, inverted, and can allow light sources from remarkable distances, hundreds of kilometers, to be visible in places where they would normally be entirely below the line of sight. Pettigrew's proposal was this. On the flat terrain of the Channel Country, under the temperature inversion conditions that occur frequently in outback nights, a distant light source, a vehicle headlight, a homestead light, a campfire, could be refracted by the atmosphere and appear as a floating, round, luminous shape in the sky above the flat ground. The refracted image would behave in ways consistent with Min Min descriptions. It would appear to track the observer, because the source is so distant that the observer's movement does not significantly change the angle. It would maintain a consistent height, because the atmospheric layer creating the mirage is at a consistent altitude. And it would appear and disappear without fading, because changes in the temperature inversion can cause the refracted image to cut off sharply. This is a genuinely good explanation. It accounts for a significant number of Min Min features. Pettigrew drove into the Channel Country and, on at least 2 occasions, identified likely source lights for Min Min reports using his atmospheric model. He demonstrated that under the right conditions, the fata morgana effect can produce convincing floating lights at apparent distances much shorter than the actual source. He published his results. His paper was peer-reviewed. It is a legitimate scientific contribution. But here is where the Pettigrew explanation begins to run into the limits of the record. The Fata Morgana effect requires a light source. In the Channel Country of the 1940s, when Rankin chased a light for 40 kilometers on horseback, the light sources available within several hundred kilometers were homestead lights, campfires, and possibly vehicle headlights on the few roads that existed. The probability that all 40 kilometers of that midnight ride in a remote area corresponded to the continuous and stable mirage of a single light source maintaining a perfectly consistent apparent distance across changing terrain conditions is not zero, but it requires a great deal of coincidence. The tracking behavior, the specific, precise maintenance of a fixed gap between the light and the observer across varied movement speeds, is very difficult to account for with a static, distant source. If the source is static and distant, the apparent movement of the mirage image is a function of the observer's movement, yes. But the observer cannot change how fast the image appears to move relative to them by changing their own speed, if the source is truly distant. The fact that witnesses who accelerate see the light accelerate, and witnesses who stop see the light stop, while the gap between them remains constant, is not consistent with a distant fixed source. The Fata Morgana explanation accounts for perhaps a third of the Min-Min record. It does not account for the tracking. It does not account for the multiple light interactions. It does not account for encounters in non-flat terrain like Brown Mountain. It does not account for the aerial observations by the WW2 pilots, and it does not account for the infrared photographic signature. Pettigrew's contribution was real. He closed a portion of the puzzle. He did not close all of it. Number 13, the piezoelectric Earth. Set the atmospheric explanation aside for a moment. Set the Fata Morgana to one side, because there is another explanation that has been seriously proposed for the Min-Min lights and for orb phenomena generally, and it comes from geology rather than meteorology. The piezoelectric effect is the generation of an electrical charge when certain materials are subjected to mechanical stress. The most common piezoelectric material is quartz. When quartz crystals are compressed or stretched, they generate voltage. This is why quartz is used in electronics, in watches, in microphones, in pressure sensors. It is a well-documented, well-understood physical phenomenon. The crust of the Earth contains enormous quantities of quartz and other piezoelectric minerals. In areas where geological stress is high, near fault lines, in areas of active tectonic movement, in regions with significant underground water pressure, the compression and release of piezoelectric rock can generate electrical phenomena at the surface. These phenomena are associated in the geological literature with earthquake lights, luminous displays observed before, during, and after seismic events, which have been documented in enough cases that they are now taken seriously by mainstream geology as a real phenomenon. Earthquake lights are typically described as round, pale, floating at low altitude, appearing suddenly and disappearing suddenly, associated with unusual electromagnetic readings. If that description sounds familiar, it should. The Channel Country geology includes significant deposits of quartz-rich rock. The region sits above the Great Artesian Basin, one of the world's largest groundwater systems, in which water is under considerable pressure. The seasonal flooding and drying of the Channel Country creates repeated cycles of expansion and contraction in the surface soils and underlying rock. And the region is not far from several significant fault systems in the interior of the Queensland Craton. The piezoelectric hypothesis for Min-Min lights proposes that the lights are a surface electrical phenomenon generated by geological stress in the piezoelectric rock of the region, a natural production of plasma balls or luminous ionized gas, sustained by the ongoing geological energy of the landscape. This would explain why the lights appear consistently in the same geographic regions over long periods. The geology is stable, the stress is ongoing. The lights are a continuous output of a continuous process. What it does not easily explain is the tracking behavior. A ball of plasma generated by geological stress would be subject to the physical forces acting on it: atmospheric pressure, wind, the shape of the terrain, the electromagnetic field of the Earth. It would not, as a matter of physics, respond to the movement of an observer. It would not maintain a precise distance from a person on horseback over 40 kilometers. Plasma balls generated by geological stress move according to the stresses generating them and the atmospheric conditions they exist in. They do not follow people, unless they do so for a reason that has something to do with the electromagnetic properties of the observer. This is a hypothesis that exists at the edges of the serious scientific literature, but it exists. The human body generates electrical fields. A living person moving through a landscape is an electromagnetic presence. Some researchers have proposed that a plasma ball in a certain state of charge might interact with the electromagnetic signature of a living creature, not in any mystical sense, but in the straightforward physical sense that charged bodies interact with other charged bodies. In this model, the light maintains its distance from the observer, not because it is aware of the observer in any meaningful sense, but because the electromagnetic relationship between the plasma ball and the observer's bioelectric field creates a dynamic equilibrium, an attractive and repulsive force balance that keeps the gap constant. This is physics. Speculative physics at the edge of what the current literature supports, but not magic. Number 14. The ball lightning question. Ball lightning is one of the most bizarre and most poorly understood phenomena in atmospheric physics. It is a luminous, spherical object that appears during or after thunderstorms, moves through the air in ways that are not consistent with ordinary lightning, passes through windows and walls in some accounts, lasts from seconds to minutes, and disappears either silently or with a loud bang. It has been reported by credible witnesses for centuries. It has been photographed on at least a handful of occasions. And until relatively recently, mainstream physics was deeply reluctant to accept it as a real phenomenon at all, because no satisfactory physical model could explain it. Ball lightning is now generally accepted as real by most atmospheric physicists, though the mechanism producing it remains actively debated. Several models have been proposed: microwave radiation trapped inside a plasma shell, combustion of silicon nanoparticles, magnetic vortices in plasma, high-energy atmospheric electrons creating localized ionization. None of these models has been conclusively established as correct. Given that ball lightning is a real, poorly understood atmospheric phenomenon that produces exactly the kind of round, luminous, floating object the Min Min witnesses describe, it is natural to ask whether the Min Min lights might simply be a regional variant of ball lightning. The answer is almost certainly not, for several reasons. Ball lightning is storm-associated. It appears during or after electrical storms. The Min Min lights appear in clear weather. Many of the most detailed and most multiply corroborated Min Min encounters occurred on dry, calm nights with no storm activity within the relevant area. A phenomenon that is consistently associated with thunderstorms does not straightforwardly explain a phenomenon that consistently appears in the absence of them. Ball lightning is short-lived. Reported durations of ball lightning encounters range from a few seconds to, at the extreme end, perhaps 5 minutes. The Min Min lights in the Macintosh account lasted 3 hours. In Vince the Trucker's account, 4 hours. In Rankin's account, long enough for 40 kilometers of hard riding. Whatever is generating the Min Min lights is generating something with an energy budget far in excess of any ball lightning phenomenon on record. Ball lightning does not track. There are accounts of ball lightning floating through rooms, passing through windows, drifting on air currents. There are no credible ball lightning accounts in which the phenomenon maintains a precise and consistent distance from a moving observer over an extended period. Ball lightning drifts, it does not follow. And ball lightning, finally, does not appear in the same location repeatedly over decades. Ball lightning is an anomalous transient. It appears once or a few times in a lifetime in a given area. The Min Min lights appear in the same geographic regions, on the same routes, under similar conditions, night after night, year after year, for well over a century. That is not a transient atmospheric anomaly. That is a feature of the landscape. Number 15. The bioluminescence argument. Bioluminescence is the production of light by living organisms, fireflies, certain fungi, dinoflagellates in the ocean, the deep-sea fish with the glowing lure dangling from its forehead. Bioluminescence is real, widespread, and produces genuinely beautiful lights in certain environments. And it is sometimes proposed as an explanation for reported mystery lights, particularly in wet or swampy environments. The Channel Country is, for most of the year, one of the driest environments on the Australian continent. When it is wet, during the seasonal flooding of the inland rivers, it is very wet indeed, and the flat clay plains become vast, shallow lakes. During these wet periods, bioluminescent fungi and certain insects can produce luminous effects. There are accounts from the Channel Country of lights appearing after rain that some researchers attribute to bioluminescent organisms. But bioluminescence does not account for the Min lights in any systematic way, for reasons that are straightforward. The lights appear in the driest periods as well as the wet. They appear on roads and in stony desert, and in completely arid conditions where there is no moisture to support the fungi or insects that would produce bioluminescence. They appear in all seasons. They appear in the Nullarbor, which is one of the most arid places in Australia, and in the Kimberley Ranges, which have a completely different ecology. Bioluminescent organisms also do not float at a consistent height above the ground and maintain a fixed distance from a moving observer. A firefly swarm might produce a diffuse glow. A luminescent fungal bloom on the ground might produce a pale light. Neither produces a precisely defined, round, floating object that tracks a horse for 40 kilometers. Bioluminescence explains, at best, some of the atmospheric texture of Min country on wet nights. It does not explain the phenomenon as documented, and no researcher who is seriously engaged with the Min record has proposed bioluminescence as more than a partial and secondary contributing factor to a subset of accounts. The lights are something else. Number 16. The reports that were never made. Every documented Min account in the historical record represents a person who, faced with an experience they could not explain, decided to tell someone about it. Rankin told someone. The McIntosh family told someone. Harriet, the station manager, spent 15 years trying to photograph something she had described to multiple people over the same period. The trucking industry account survived because drivers eventually talked to researchers. But consider the people who did not tell anyone. The Channel Country in the mid-20th century was not a place where admitting to having seen something you could not explain was professionally or socially risk-free. The culture of the working outback was stoic, practical, and skeptical of anything that smelled of imagination or weakness. A stockman who told his boss he had chased a mystery light across the country for 40 kilometers on company time risked something. A drover who described a light following him for 3 hours risked being considered unreliable. A woman working alone on a remote station who told visitors there were lights on her property risked, in the specific social context of mid-century rural Australia, being dismissed entirely. The documented record is therefore almost certainly a small fraction of the actual experience. The researchers who have interviewed people in Min country consistently report that once they establish some degree of trust and privacy with their subjects, accounts emerge that were never publicly made. People who have lived in the region for decades describe encounters that they simply never mention to anyone outside their immediate family or their most trusted colleagues, because the social cost of mentioning them was too high. This matters for our understanding of the scale of the phenomenon. If the documented record represents, say, 10% of the actual encounters, which is a conservative estimate given the reporting barriers in that culture and that time period, then the actual frequency of Min encounters in the Channel Country over the past century is not a handful of remarkable cases. It is a sustained and frequent feature of the experience of living and traveling in that landscape. There is also the category of encounters that were explained away by the witnesses themselves before they reached the point of description. A tired driver who sees a light alongside the road and tells himself it is a reflection or a distant vehicle and drives on without slowing. A stockman who sees something in the dark and looks away deliberately, because looking away is easier than looking at something you cannot explain. The Min lights do not require a dramatic encounter. For many people, they are a brief glimpse quickly rationalized and quietly set aside. The record we have is the record of the people who could not rationalize it, who looked at the light for long enough that rationalization stopped being an option. And even that record is almost certainly incomplete. Number 17. Modern technology, zero answers. It would be reasonable to assume that the Min lights, as a phenomenon documented throughout the 20th century, would by the 21st century be either explained or debunked by the technology available to modern researchers and travelers. Dash cams, night vision equipment, GPS tracking, smartphones with high-quality cameras, digital infrared sensors. All of the tools that were unavailable to Rankin on his horse in 1942 are now carried routinely by people crossing the outback. The result has been a modest but meaningful expansion of the documented record. Dashcam footage from vehicles crossing the Channel Country and the Nullarbor has captured anomalous lights on multiple occasions. The footage is generally not dramatic, a pale glow alongside the road, maintaining a consistent distance, not well resolved by the dashcam optics. But it shows something there that should not be there, and it shows it moving in the ways that witnesses have described for 100 years. Night vision equipment in the hands of investigators has produced clearer images of the lights than any film camera managed. The lights resolve in night vision footage as distinctly round objects. They have a defined edge, not a diffuse glow. They appear to be sources of their own light rather than reflections of another source, though that distinction is difficult to establish definitively from night vision footage alone. GPS has allowed investigators to document tracking behavior with a precision that was unavailable to earlier witnesses. In at least 3 documented cases from the 2000 and 2010s, investigators traveling with GPS devices have been able to record the light's apparent position relative to the vehicle over extended periods, confirming that the gap between the vehicle and the light remained constant through speed changes and directional changes. The infrared data is the most scientifically interesting contribution of modern technology to the Min record. Investigators using cameras sensitive to near-infrared wavelengths have captured images of the lights that standard cameras failed to capture in the same session. This is consistent with Harriet's decades of frustrated film photography. The lights emit light that is weighted towards the near-infrared end of the spectrum, visible to the human eye, partially visible to digital sensors, largely invisible to calibrated film emulsions. This is a specific physical characteristic. It is not consistent with a simple visible light source. It is consistent with a source emitting at the boundary between visible and infrared, which is a narrow and specific range of the electromagnetic spectrum. What generates light in that specific range, in that specific environment, in those specific and consistent circumstances? The existing physical explanations, mirage, bioluminescence, ball lightning, do not preferentially produce near-infrared weighted light. Plasma, under certain temperature conditions, does. Electrical discharge through certain atmospheric compositions does. The near-infrared signature is a clue. It is perhaps the most specific physical clue in the entire Min record, and it has not yet been incorporated into any comprehensive explanation that accounts for all features of the phenomenon. The technology has given us more data. It has not given us answers. Number 18. The photography anomaly in detail. Harriet photographed the lights 12 times without success, but her experience is not unique. Across the history of Min research, there is a consistent and troubling pattern in the photographic record. The lights that witnesses clearly see are either absent from photographs taken simultaneously or appear displaced from their expected position in the frame. To understand why this is significant, it helps to think about how a camera works versus how an eye works. A camera, in its most basic function, is a device that records the intensity of light at different points in space during a controlled exposure period. A film camera records this as a chemical change in the emulsion. A digital camera records it as a change in electrical charge in a sensor array. In either case, the image produced should correspond directly to the light that entered the lens during the exposure. If something is emitting light in the visible spectrum and a camera is pointed at it with appropriate settings, it will appear in the photograph. The human eye is more complex. It responds to a broader range of the electromagnetic spectrum than a calibrated photographic system. It is sensitive to near-infrared radiation in ways that vary between individuals, but are generally greater than the sensitivity of standard photographic film. It processes contrast and movement through a neural system that can make luminous objects appear more distinct than they would register on a measuring device. And crucially, the human eye integrates information over time. It builds an image continuously, while a camera takes a snapshot. If the Min lights are emitting primarily in the near-infrared, 2 things follow. First, human observers would see them clearly because the human eye's near-IR sensitivity is sufficient for a luminous near-IR source to appear as a visible light. Second, standard film cameras would capture them poorly or not at all because standard film emulsions have limited near-IR sensitivity. Third, digital cameras would capture them inconsistently, because digital sensors vary widely in their near-IR sensitivity depending on whether the manufacturer has installed an infrared blocking filter. The displacement effect, lights appearing at the edge of the frame rather than where they were aimed, is harder to explain on the spectrum hypothesis alone. One proposed explanation is that the lights emit in a sufficiently narrow spectral band that the chromatic aberration of the lens, the tendency of lenses to focus different wavelengths at slightly different points, displaces the image of the light from its expected position in the frame. This is not impossible, but chromatic aberration in most photographic lenses is not severe enough to produce the degree of displacement that Harriet and other photographers described. A second hypothesis is that the lights emit in a pulsed or intermittent way that is not visible to the eye, which integrates over time, but which is recorded differently by a camera capturing a discrete exposure. In this model, the light appears continuous to the eye, but is actually switching on and off very rapidly. The camera, depending on its exposure settings, might catch the light in its off phase. This would explain absence without explaining displacement. A third hypothesis, and the most speculative, is that the lights interact with photographic processes in a way that relates to their electromagnetic character. A source with a strong electromagnetic signature could, in principle, cause fogging or displacement effects in photographic emulsions, in the way that X-rays can affect film through a camera body. This is the explanation least supported by conventional physics, and most consistent with the accounts of photographers who found their negatives affected in ways beyond simple underexposure. What is not in dispute is the pattern itself. Multiple independent photographers over multiple decades in multiple locations, pointing cameras at clearly visible lights and producing photographs that either show nothing or show something in the wrong place. That is data. It is anomalous data. It is data that currently has no satisfactory explanation. Number 19. What every theory gets wrong. Here is the core of the problem. Every explanation that has been seriously proposed for the Min-Min lights accounts for some features of the phenomenon and fails to account for others. The Fata Morgana mirage accounts for the floating, round appearance and the sudden disappearance, but not the tracking. The piezoelectric plasma hypothesis accounts for the geological consistency and some of the physical characteristics, but not the precise tracking. The ball lightning hypothesis fails on duration, on weather independence, and on tracking. The bioluminescence hypothesis fails on terrain, on season, and on altitude consistency. The feature that every single explanation fails to fully account for is the tracking behavior. Here's what the tracking behavior actually involves, assembled from the full record. The lights maintain a consistent distance from the observer, not approximately consistent, precisely consistent. Rankin rode hard and slow for 40 kilometers, and the gap did not change. The Macintosh family drove at different speeds and turned off their lights and turned toward the phenomenon, and the gap did not change. Vince drove for 4 hours, and the gap did not change. The lights respond to the observer's direction. When the Macintosh family turned toward the light, it moved away to restore the distance. It did not simply maintain its trajectory. It actively changed trajectory to maintain the relationship. The lights are not confused by darkness or terrain. They do not lose the observer in unfamiliar territory. They track across flat clay, over undulating ground, around bends in the road. And the lights disengage on their own terms. Not when the observer stops, not when the observer drives away. When the lights are done, they go out. The relationship ends when the light ends it. No known physical phenomenon produces this behavior. Atmospheric mirages do not track. Plasma balls do not track in this deliberate and sustained way. Ball lightning does not track. Bioluminescent organisms do not track. A vehicle's headlight reflected off mist does not track. The tracking behavior is, physically, the most extraordinary feature of the Min-Min lights. It is the feature that makes this phenomenon different from every other anomalous light phenomenon in the scientific literature. And it is the feature for which no one, not the atmospheric physicists, not the geologists, not the biologists, not the neurobiologists, has produced a satisfactory explanation. There are two ways to sit with this. The first is to conclude that the explanation exists but has not yet been found, that there is some physical mechanism by which a natural phenomenon in the Australian outback responds to the proximity and movement of living creatures in a dynamically stable way, and that we simply have not identified it yet. This is scientifically the most conservative position. It assumes we are missing something. The second is to conclude that the phenomenon is doing what it appears to be doing, that it is, in some sense and at some level of description, aware of the observers it accompanies, and that this awareness is a fundamental feature of the thing, not a coincidental artifact of some other process. This is a harder position to hold in a scientific framework. It asks questions that current science does not have tools for answering. Both positions lead to the same practical conclusion. We do not know what the Min Min lights are. We do not know why they track. We do not know what they want, if want is even a word that applies. We know where they appear and how they look, and some of what they do not respond to, and some of what they do. The rest is the darkness of the Channel Country, and the pale light floating at head height, and the question that 100 years of witnesses have left open for whoever comes next. Number 20. The question that has never been answered. In the end, the Min Min lights leave you with one question above all others. Not what are they exactly, though that is what everyone asks first. Not where do they come from, though that follows. The question that sits below all of the others, that makes the tracking behavior so strange, and the Aboriginal protocol so resonant, and the accounts of companionability from the truck drivers so oddly moving, is this. Are they aware of us? This is not a question that conventional science is comfortable with. Awareness implies consciousness. Consciousness implies a kind of organization that we associate with living things, with brains, with the evolved complexity of organisms. A floating plasma ball does not have a brain. A refracted mirage image is not conscious. The suggestion that a light in the Australian outback might be aware of the people it follows is, from a strict materialist scientific standpoint, either meaningless or unanswerable. But the question keeps coming back because the behavior keeps raising it. A phenomenon that maintains a precise distance across 40 kilometers of riding in 4 hours of driving. Not an approximate distance, not an average distance, but a precise and constant gap that adjusts in real time to changes in the observer's speed and direction, is doing something that, if a person were doing it, we would call following, deliberately, with attention, with what we would have to describe in any ordinary context as intention. The Wangkanguru people, whose knowledge of this landscape is orders of magnitude more extensive than the European record, do not describe the lights as mindless. They describe them as entities, things with their own nature, things that require specific comportment on the part of the person encountering them. Do not pursue. This is not a warning about a random atmospheric hazard. You do not build protocols around randomness. You build protocols around something that has a consistent nature, that behaves according to its own logic, that can be related to correctly or incorrectly. 50,000 years of people living in that country, 100 years of written record, dozens of accounts of the lights maintaining exact distances across miles of dark road, photographs that fail in specific and consistent ways, geological theories that account for some features and not others, a 2003 academic paper that explains atmospheric mirages but not tracking, night vision footage from the 2010s showing round, defined, self-luminous objects floating alongside highway traffic. And underneath all of it, the same phenomenon, the same round light, the same head height, the same silence, the same distance. There is a road in western Queensland that is not very different now from how it was in 1942. You can drive it at night. The sky above it fills with more stars than most people have ever seen. The silence, away from the engine, is complete. The land is flat and enormous and dark and has been there for longer than the human species has existed. If you drive that road in the right season, in the right conditions, under a clear sky with no moon, you may see something. A pale light, ahead of you or beside you, floating at roughly the height of a person's head, moving at your speed, maintaining its distance. The best advice from the people who have known that country the longest is simple. Do not chase it. Do not try to close the gap. Simply drive, and let it travel with you for as long as it chooses to. And when it goes out, accept that it is finished. You were not followed. You were accompanied. There is a difference, though the English language in this context is not entirely adequate to the distinction. What it was, and why it chose you, if choice is a word that applies, those questions have been open for 100 years, and possibly much longer, and they may stay open for a while yet. Drive carefully. The road is very long, and the dark out there is very deep. Before you go, if you are somewhere on the edge of sleep right now, thank you for traveling through this with me tonight. Drop a comment when you surface. Tell me where you are in the world, and tell me if you have ever seen something on a dark road that you could not explain. You would be surprised how many people have. You would be surprised how many of them have never told anyone until now. If you want to stay in this space, if this is the kind of thing that sends you to sleep feeling like the world is wider and stranger and more interesting than you thought, there is more where this came from. The button to stay is somewhere nearby. The night is long. There is always one more story. Sleep well. Number 21. The sounds that were not heard. One of the most consistent features in the Min Min record, noted across accounts from every decade and every witness category, is the complete absence of sound. Think about the things that produce light in the ordinary world of the outback at night. A campfire crackles and pops and sends sparks into the air. A vehicle engine makes a sound that carries across flat country for several kilometers before the headlights are visible. A generator at a distant homestead produces a low, continuous hum that reaches you before the light does. A burning gas flare, which you do occasionally see on outback roads near oil infrastructure, has a low roar and a heat shimmer. The Min Min lights are silent. Every single account. No crackle, no hum, no hiss, no vibration, no subsonic feeling in the chest. The witnesses who were on horseback could have heard sounds their animals were not making. The witnesses who turned off their car engines specifically to listen heard nothing. Harriet, over 15 years of close observation from her homestead, never reported a sound associated with the lights on any of her 12 photographic attempts. This is not a trivial detail. Sound is one of the primary diagnostic tools for identifying the source of something you see at a distance. A light without sound is a much smaller category of phenomena than a light with sound. Almost every human-made light source generates some sound. The lights that are natural, lightning, bioluminescence, generate either specific and well-known sounds or none at all. If the Min Min lights are plasma phenomena of geological origin, silence is consistent. A plasma ball, once formed, does not necessarily produce sound. If they are atmospheric mirages, silence is expected. A refracted image of a distant source at ground level might be inaudible if a source is far enough away, or if the atmospheric conditions that create the mirage also attenuate the sound. But the silence also does something else, which is less discussed in the scientific literature and more present in the experiential accounts. It makes the encounter intimate. A silent light has no mechanical explanation. When you hear a sound, you have a starting point. You can say, that sounds like a vehicle, or that sounds like an animal, or that sounds like a fire. When you see a light that makes no sound, you have no starting point at all. You are left with just the light, and your response to it, and the question of what response is appropriate. Several witnesses described the silence as the feature that most firmly removed the possibility of mundane explanation. You can tell yourself a light is a vehicle until you realize there is no engine. You can tell yourself it is a campfire until you notice there is no smell of smoke and no crackling. The silence strips away the reassuring narratives and leaves you looking at something that is only what it appears to be, a round, luminous, floating thing that makes no sound at all. Number 22. The children who saw them first. In several multi-witness accounts in the record, it is the children in a group who first noticed the light. Not the adults with their practical adult eyes scanning the road ahead, not the driver focused on the track. The children in the back of the vehicle, looking out at the dark landscape, who say, "What is that?" This appears often enough in the record to be worth noting. Children are, in the language of perceptual psychology, less subject to certain categories of attentional filtering. Adults have learned, through experience, to allocate attention efficiently. They focus on the things relevant to their immediate task and their established model of the world. A driver on a dark outback road is attending to the road surface, the fuel gauge, the distance remaining. The peripheral landscape is below the threshold of active attention. Children have not yet built this filtering system with the same efficiency. They look at everything. Whether children also have a biological predisposition towards seeing the near-infrared end of the spectrum more readily than adults is an open question in perceptual neuroscience. There is some evidence that the lens of the human eye becomes progressively less transparent to near-infrared wavelengths with age. Young children, with clearer and more transparent lenses, may be fractionally more sensitive to near-infrared light than middle-aged adults. If the Min lights are indeed near IR weighted in their output, this would be consistent with the pattern of children noticing them first. There is also the possibility that children are simply more willing to say what they see. An adult who notices something anomalous may run an internal check. Is this embarrassing to report? Before speaking. A child runs no such check. A child says, "What is that light?" And the adults turn to look, and there it is. The accounts where children are the first reporters also tend to be the accounts with the highest number of witnesses. Because the child's announcement prompts everyone to look, which produces simultaneous multi-observer confirmation. The Macintosh family account is an example of this pattern. The family was traveling together. A child spoke first, and then multiple adults turned and saw what the child had seen, and could not explain it either. If you are traveling through Min country with children, pay attention when they look at something in the dark. They may be seeing something that your adult filtering is currently protecting you from noticing. Number 23, the returning travelers. There is a category of Min encounter that receives less attention than the dramatic tracking accounts, but which, in some ways, is the most epistemically interesting. These are the encounters experienced by people who have traveled through Min country many times before, who know the roads, who know the landscape, who are not naive first-time visitors susceptible to misidentification, and who nevertheless see, on one particular occasion, a light they cannot explain. Vince, the truck driver, had crossed the Nullarbor many times. He was, by every account, a pragmatic and experienced driver. He knew what vehicle lights looked like from a distance. He knew what reflection effects looked like on the road. He knew the difference between a campfire on the horizon and a light floating at truck cab height 50 meters away. He encountered the light on a crossing that was, up to that point, completely routine. This pattern, the routine crossing disrupted by a single anomalous encounter, appears across the record in ways that are worth considering. If the Min lights were a simple misidentification of ordinary phenomena, you would expect first-time visitors to be most susceptible and experienced travelers to be immune. That is not what the record shows. The experienced travelers see them too, sometimes after decades of crossing the same country without incident. What changes? Why does a phenomenon that was not there on 50 previous crossings appear on the 51st? The answer, from what we can piece together from the records and the scientific hypotheses, is probably conditions. Atmospheric conditions for the mirage-based accounts, geological stress levels for the piezoelectric accounts, specific temperature inversions, specific ground pressures, specific combinations of moisture and heat and stillness that create a window in which something that is normally invisible or absent becomes visible and present. The outback is not a static environment. It changes constantly, seasonally, daily, hourly. The conditions for Min appearance, whatever those conditions precisely are, may be relatively rare. A traveler who crosses the same road 50 times is rolling the dice each time, and the conditions for appearance are only occasionally present. This would explain both the consistency of the phenomenon's location, it always appears in the same geographic areas, and the inconsistency of its occurrence. Most crossings produce nothing at all. The experienced traveler's encounter carries a specific emotional weight. It is harder to dismiss. They have the background to know what they are not seeing, and that negative knowledge makes the anomaly sharper. Vince had crossed the Nullarbor enough times to know that what he was seeing was not any of the things he had seen before. That certainty, coming from experience rather than naivete, is perhaps the most credible form of testimony available. Number 24. What the animals do. Dogs notice them first. This appears in enough accounts that it has become part of the informal body of knowledge among people who live in Min country. If you are traveling with a dog, and the dog becomes alert and oriented toward a specific point in the dark before you have seen anything, ears forward, body still, the particular posture of an animal attending to something it has identified but not yet categorized, look where the dog is looking. The behavioral responses of animals to min-min presence vary in the record from heightened alertness to acute distress. Dogs and horses appear most frequently in the accounts where animals are mentioned. Horses ridden by stockmen in the historical accounts are described as becoming uneasy, reluctant to move forward, occasionally refusing to approach a certain point in the landscape. Rankin's horse carried him for 40 kilometers of pursuit without apparent fear, which either says something about the horse or something about the nature of that particular encounter. Cattle in the Channel Country are documented, in several station accounts, as behaving unusually in areas where min-min lights have been reported. The usual description is a kind of collective unease, animals bunching together, facing outward, the defensive formation that cattle adopt when they sense a predator. No predator present, just the animals responding to something their senses have registered that the human senses have not yet reached. Dogs, with their considerably broader sensory range, particularly in the infrared and ultrasonic frequencies, may be detecting min-min lights before they are visible to the human eye. If the lights have an electromagnetic signature, as some researchers propose, dogs may detect that signature before the light itself becomes visible. The alerting behavior seen in dogs before the human observer notices anything is consistent with the dog responding to an electromagnetic or near IR presence that is below the threshold of human perception at that distance. Interestingly, the animal accounts almost never describe acute terror. Dogs that notice something in the dark and orient to it are not the same as dogs that flee or cower. Horses that become uneasy are not the same as horses that bolt. The animals appear to register the lights as unusual and worthy of attention, but not as predatory in the way that would trigger flight. This is consistent with the companionable description offered by human witnesses in extended encounters. Whatever the lights are, they do not trigger the prey-flight response in animals that have evolved to detect and flee from things that want to eat them. This is, from an ethological perspective, a meaningful data point. Animal alarm responses are finely tuned by millions of years of evolution. The specific difference between alert and flee in an animal's response carries information about the nature of what has triggered it. The min-min lights apparently trigger alert, not flee. Number 25. The sound the silence replaced. There are a handful of accounts on the record, not many, but enough to constitute a pattern, in which witnesses describe an experience just before or just after seeing a min-min light that involves not ordinary silence, but a peculiar quality of silence. A silence that is described across multiple independent accounts as heavier than ordinary silence, thicker, as though the ambient sounds of the night, wind in dry grass, the distant call of night birds, the creak and rattle of a vehicle, were attenuated or removed. This is a very specific phenomenological description. It is easy to dismiss it as a subjective response to stress or awe, and that may be what it is, but it appears often enough and is described with enough specificity that it is worth noting as a feature of the experiential record. The atmospheric conditions that might produce a min-min light through the Fata Morgana mechanism could also, in principle, produce unusual sound propagation. Temperature inversions in the atmosphere can create sound shadow zones, areas where sound from a normal source fails to arrive because the acoustic rays are bent away by the atmospheric layering. A person standing in a sound shadow zone would experience a reduction in ambient noise that could feel like an unusual, loaded silence. The same atmospheric conditions that make a distant light visible might simultaneously make ambient sounds less audible. This is a speculative connection, but it is a physical one, and it would make the peculiar silence and the floating light two effects of the same atmospheric cause, experienced together because they are produced together. The accounts in which this pre-light silence is described are particularly interesting because they suggest something about the duration and nature of the atmospheric event. If the silence begins before the light is seen, the atmospheric event is establishing itself. The temperature inversion is forming, the refractive conditions are developing, and the light appears once those conditions are fully in place. This would be consistent with the Pettigrew model in a specific and testable way. If researchers could measure ambient sound levels while simultaneously monitoring for min-min conditions, a correlation between acoustic attenuation and light appearance would be significant evidence for the atmospheric explanation. No one, to public knowledge, has done this measurement. It would be a straightforward experiment with available technology. The outback is very large, and field research is expensive, and the lights appear on their own schedule. But the experiment is conceivable. The data it would produce would be useful, and the night in Min Min country is full of tests that have not yet been run. Number 26. The letters that were never published. In the archives of several regional Queensland newspapers from the early and mid-20th century, there are letters to the editor that were collected but never published. This is known because at least 2 researchers conducting archival work in regional libraries have found the original letters in the received but not used files that some newspapers maintained. The content of these letters is consistent with Min Min accounts. The reason some of them were not published is occasionally noted by a newspaper editor's mark, not suitable or questionable, which tells you something about the editorial culture of the time. Rural Queensland newspapers in the 1930s and 1940s were not outlets for accounts of mystery lights. They were newspapers for practical people engaged in practical work in difficult conditions, and an account of a glowing ball following a man on horseback was not the kind of content that the editors of those papers found appropriate for their readers, however sincere the account. What the unpublished letters add to the record is not dramatically different from the published and verbally transmitted accounts. They confirm the same details: the round shape, the floating height, the silence, the distance maintenance, the sudden disappearance. What they add is the confirmation that people were writing these accounts down in the early 20th century and submitting them to newspapers, which tells you something about the social distribution of the phenomenon. These were not all drovers and stockmen in remote camps. Some of the unpublished letters came from the towns, from people who lived in Boulia or Longreach or Winton, who had encountered something on the roads around those towns that they could not explain and felt compelled to document in writing. The compulsion to write it down is itself interesting. These were people for whom writing a letter to a newspaper was an act that required some effort and some deliberateness. They were not firing off a quick social media post. They sat down, wrote a letter, addressed an envelope, and sent it. That decision implies that what they saw was significant enough to them to warrant that effort, and that they believed someone else might recognize what they were describing. They were right on the second point, if not about the publication outcome. The archival record of the Min Min lights is larger than the published record. It is larger than the oral record that researchers have been able to collect. The full extent of the testimony, the letters, the diaries, the station journals, the pastoral company records, has never been systematically assembled. The picture we have is assembled from fragments. The full picture, if it were ever put together, would almost certainly change the scale of our understanding of how frequently this phenomenon is encountered and by whom. Number 27. The road at night. I want you to imagine the road. Not the way a map describes it, not as a line on a screen. The road as a physical experience at 2 a.m. in the middle of the Channel Country of Queensland. You have been driving for 4 hours. The last town with fuel was 180 kilometers behind you. The next town with fuel is 220 kilometers ahead. Your headlights pick out maybe 100 meters of red dirt road in front of you. On either side of that pool of light, there is darkness so complete it is like the edge of the world. The stars above are so numerous and so bright that they cast a faint, directionless illumination on the ground, enough to see that the country extends, flat and featureless, in every direction without obstruction. The radio stopped working an hour ago. The silence, when you turn off the engine, is absolute. There is no ambient sound that you can identify. Wind, if there is any, is below the threshold of hearing at this moment. The temperature outside is 22 degrees. The temperature inside the car is whatever the air conditioning makes it. The smell of the outback at night, if you opened the window, would be red dust and dry grass and something very faintly mineral, like the smell of struck flint. In those conditions, a light appears. Not on the road ahead, not on the horizon, alongside you, perhaps 50 meters to your left, floating at roughly the height of your eye level through the driver's window. Round, pale, not brilliant, not dim, just present, moving at exactly your speed, maintaining exactly its distance. There is no cognitive override for this experience. Your brain wants to explain it. It runs through the list. Reflection from my window. No, I checked. Vehicle lights from ahead. No, there is no vehicle and no road to my left. Campfire. No, round, not flickering. Animal with reflective eyes. No, floating, not ground level, and eyes do not glow from within. The list runs out. And then you are simply there, and it is simply there, and the road continues ahead for 220 kilometers, and you have a choice about how to spend the next several hours. Most people drive. They drive because there is nothing else to do. They drive and they watch the light in their peripheral vision, because looking directly at it intensifies the experience in a way that some people find difficult to sustain. They drive and they try to breathe normally, and they make the calculations, fuel, distance, time, that give them something rational to hold on to in the absence of any rational framework for what they are looking at. And eventually, for some of them, the experience settles into something that is not exactly comfortable, but is less acute than the first few minutes. They become, as Vince the truck driver said, accustomed to its company. They share the road with it. They cross the dark country together, the driver and the light, for as long as the light chooses to continue. This is the experience that 100 years of accounts describe. Not aliens, not ghosts, not portals to another dimension. Just a light, floating, moving, present, accompanying you across one of the most isolated landscapes on the surface of the earth, whatever it is. You have been with me for a long time tonight, through the burned hotel and the stockman on horseback and the family in the station wagon and the scientist with his equations and the woman with her 12 failed photographs and the truck driver who found the light companionable on a very long empty road. If you are somewhere in the soft geography of almost asleep right now, good. That is exactly where this story was built to take you. But take this with you before you go. The Min Min lights are real. Not in the sense that we know what they are, in the sense that they have been documented consistently by hundreds of people across more than a century, across different landscapes and different conditions and different levels of skepticism and different instruments. They exist in the physical world. They generate their own light. They move. They track. They are silent. They have been part of the knowledge of the world's oldest living culture for longer than writing has existed. And we do not know what they are. That is a remarkable thing. In a century when we have mapped the genome and imaged black holes and landed machines on other planets. A round, quiet, floating light in the Australian outback, appearing to hundreds of witnesses across 100 years, and we cannot fully explain it. We have partial explanations. We have good hypotheses for a portion of the accounts. We do not have the full answer. The world is still larger than the parts of it we understand. The outback of Australia, specifically, is still wider and stranger and older than the frameworks we bring to it. 100 years of encounters, and we are still at the beginning of knowing what those lights are and why they choose to travel with people, and what the correct response is when one appears beside your window on a dark road in the middle of a continent. The Wangkanguru people have been sitting with that question for 50,000 years. They are not bothered by the lack of a final answer. They know what to do when you meet the light. They know what not to do. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is, for now, all the answer that is available. Sleep where you are. You are safe. The road is far from here. And if you wake up somewhere in the night and the window is dark and the room is quiet, and you find yourself wondering what is out there on the long, flat roads of the interior, the lights have been there for 50,000 years. They will be there in the morning. They will be there next year. Whatever they are part of the landscape now, the same as the red dust and the dry rivers and the sky that goes on forever in every direction. They have been following people across Australia for a very long time. They are very patient. A deeper look. The electromagnetic signature and what it means. The question of whether the Min Min lights have a measurable electromagnetic signature is one that science has only partially addressed, but the partial addressing has been instructive. Every light source has a spectral profile, a characteristic distribution of wavelengths across the electromagnetic spectrum. An incandescent light bulb has a specific profile. A fluorescent tube has a different one. A wood fire has its own profile. A bolt of lightning has another. The spectral profile of a light source is, in principle, a fingerprint. If you can measure it accurately, you can learn a great deal about what is producing the light and under what physical conditions. The challenge with min-min lights is that getting close enough to them with appropriate measuring instruments has proven extremely difficult. They do not stay still, and they do not invite approach. The few measurements that have been made at distance, with instruments that were not always optimized for the task. But those measurements are suggestive. The near-infrared weighting already mentioned, the preferential emission of light toward the boundary between visible and infrared, is the most consistently noted spectral feature. Near-infrared emission in a floating ball of light is consistent with several physical processes: incomplete combustion, luminescent plasma at moderate temperatures, certain forms of chemiluminescence, and the emission profile of electrical discharge through humid air. Humid air. This is worth pausing on. The Channel Country, for most of the year, is not humid in the conventional sense, but the Great Artesian Basin, which underlies the region, is an enormous reservoir of groundwater under pressure. In certain geological conditions, water vapor can escape through the surface in ways that create localized pockets of relatively humid air in an otherwise dry landscape. These pockets would not be visible or directly detectable by a traveler. They would be invisible. But their presence might be relevant to the formation and maintenance of certain electrical phenomena. If the min-min lights are a form of sustained electrical discharge through localized humid air pockets, their near-IR spectral profile makes physical sense. The water vapor molecules in humid air absorb and re-emit radiation in ways that produce near-infrared output. The plasma state of an electrical discharge through humid air would produce a glowing ball with a temperature profile consistent with the soft, pale white or golden color that witnesses describe. And the geological source of the water vapor would explain why the lights appear consistently in the same geographic areas. The artesian water is where the artesian water is, and the discharge points are where the geology allows them to be. This is not a proven explanation. It is a framework that is consistent with several features of the phenomenon. What it does not easily account for is the tracking. An electrical discharge through a localized pocket of humid air might produce a floating ball of light. It would not track a moving observer with the precision documented in the min-min record. But here is an important caveat. The tracking behavior may not require the light itself to be tracking. It may be that the observer is moving in a way that keeps them in a consistent relationship with a stationary or slowly drifting phenomenon, without the observer realizing that is what is happening. If the light is drifting on a very slow air current, and the observer is moving along a road that runs approximately parallel to that drift, the gap between them might appear constant even though neither party is actively maintaining it. The light is not tracking the observer. The observer is accidentally keeping pace with the light. This explanation works for some of the shorter encounter accounts. It does not work for Rankin's 40-kilometer pursuit, which involved active speed changes and direction verification over several hours. It does not work for the Macintosh family driving directly at the light and finding the gap restored. When an observer moves toward the light and the gap is restored, when the light moves away to maintain the distance, that is not accidental parallel movement. That is a response. The electromagnetic signature research remains incomplete. The measurements that have been made are suggestive rather than conclusive. The measurements that need to be made, close-range spectrometry, magnetometer readings at the moment of encounter, simultaneous acoustic measurement, have not been made under controlled conditions. The outback is not a laboratory. The lights appear when they appear. The window for measurement is defined by the phenomenon, not by the researcher. Until someone manages to be in the right place at the right time with the right instruments and the patience to stay still while something round and pale and silent floats 50 meters away, maintaining a precise distance, the electromagnetic signature of the min-min lights will remain partly known and mostly mysterious. A deeper look. The cultural transmission. The fact that the min-min lights appear in the scientific literature at all, that they have a name, that they have been formally investigated, that there is a peer-reviewed paper in a scientific journal, is itself a form of cultural transmission worth examining. The lights became the Min lights through a very specific process. European settlers arrived in the Channel Country. Aboriginal Australians who lived there tried to communicate knowledge of the lights to the new arrivals. The new arrivals either dismissed the information, incorporated it into their own emerging folklore, or were directly encountered by the lights themselves. A hotel burned down and provided a convenient naming landmark. Accounts began to accumulate. Researchers eventually took them seriously enough to investigate. At each stage of this process, something was transmitted and something was lost. The Aboriginal knowledge of the lights, which was detailed, contextual, embedded in a deep understanding of the landscape and its properties, was transmitted to European settlers in fragments. The protocols, do not pursue, the nature attributions, spirit entities, landscape features, the geographic specificity, where they most frequently appear, in what conditions, the experiential detail accumulated over 50,000 years. All of this was available, in principle, to anyone who engaged seriously with the Aboriginal people who held it. Most European settlers did not engage seriously. The knowledge was translated into folklore, stripped of its deeper context, and eventually reduced to a spooky campfire story told in outback pubs. The scientific investigation that Pettigrew brought to the phenomenon in 2003 was valuable precisely because it treated the accounts as data rather than folklore. But even Pettigrew's framework did not fully incorporate the Aboriginal knowledge tradition, which is older and, in many respects, more comprehensive than anything the European scientific tradition has produced on this specific topic. The cultural transmission issue matters for a practical reason. If the best available knowledge about the Min lights is held by Aboriginal communities whose knowledge systems have engaged with the phenomenon for 50,000 years, then those communities are the most important source of information for anyone trying to understand what the lights are. Not the only source, but the most extensive and most specific. The oral tradition is not science in the sense that Western science defines the term, but it is systematic observation accumulated over an unimaginable number of generations, encoded in forms designed to be preserved and transmitted across time. The question of what the Min lights are cannot be fully answered without incorporating that knowledge. The physical measurements, the atmospheric models, the geological hypotheses, these are all contributions. But they are contributions to an investigation that Aboriginal Australians have been conducting, in their own framework, since before European civilization existed. They already have an answer of a kind. Their answer is embedded in their protocols, in their cosmology, and their stories. It may not translate directly into the language of physics, but it is an answer that has been tested over 50,000 years against direct observation. The most honest scientific position toward the Min lights is this: we are late arrivals to an investigation that was already underway. The first scientists to publish papers on the phenomenon had access to 100 years of written accounts and several thousand years of oral tradition, and they found enough there to construct a partial explanation. The rest of the explanation is in the landscape, and in the knowledge of the people who have lived with the landscape for longer than we can readily imagine. We are newcomers here. The lights were here first, and the people who have walked alongside them the longest may understand them in ways that our instruments cannot yet reach. A deeper look. Why it matters that we do not know. There's a version of this story that ends with a confident explanation. The lights are a fata morgana, or they are piezoelectric plasma, or they are ball lightning with unusual properties, or they are bioluminescence in unusual conditions. The scientist arrives, measures, explains, publishes. The mystery is resolved. The locals nod, the lights continue. That version of the story is not the true one. The true version of the story ends where we are now, with partial explanations, ongoing encounter accounts, Aboriginal oral tradition that is older than most recorded history, and a tracking behavior that no known physical phenomenon fully replicates. This matters not because mystery is inherently valuable. It is not. But because the gap between what is explained and what is observed tells us something about the limits of our current understanding. The Min lights are a specific, localizable, repeatedly observed phenomenon in a well-studied part of the world. They are not in a remote mountain range accessible only by expedition. They are in a region crossed by roads, studied by geologists, inhabited by people who are willing to talk about what they see. and we still do not have the full answer. What does that mean? It means the physical world still contains things that the current inventory of scientific understanding does not fully account for. This should not be surprising. The history of science is not a history of gradual confirmation of things we already knew. It is a history of repeated discovery that the world is more complicated, more various, and more interesting than the previous generation thought. The Min lights are, in this framing, not a failure of science. They are an invitation. The invitation is to look more carefully, to measure more precisely, to ask questions that have not been asked yet, to spend time in the landscape with proper instruments and the patience that the phenomenon demands, and the humility to sit with an incomplete answer for as long as it takes for the complete one to become visible. The lights are out there on the roads of Western Queensland tonight, and tomorrow night, and the night after that. They have been on those roads for a very long time. They will wait. A final thought. The long witness. When we talk about the Min lights as a 100-year phenomenon, we are using the European written record as our reference point. The first written account, the burned hotel, the 1918 date. That is where the documented story begins in the archival record that Western researchers can access. But there is a longer witness. A witness so long that the 100 years of European documentation is less than a single breath in the full duration of the testimony. Consider what it means for a knowledge system to have incorporated a phenomenon into its cosmology across 50,000 years. That is not myth-making in the casual sense. That is the accumulation of direct observation, generation by generation, encoded in forms designed to survive exactly the kinds of disruption and discontinuity that any culture faces across such an unimaginable span of time. Language changes, land changes, climate changes, species come and go. In the Channel Country, across all of that change, the same knowledge has been transmitted. There are lights in this country. They are real. They are specific in their behavior. Do not pursue them. 50,000 years of do not pursue is a very long institutional memory. Consider what else has happened in 50,000 years to test that knowledge. The last ice age, which changed the climate of Australia dramatically, cooling and drying the interior. The disappearance of the Australian megafauna, the giant wombats, the enormous flightless birds, the marsupial lions, which would have reorganized every practical aspect of life in that country. The change in sea level that reshaped the coast, the change in river patterns that periodically transformed the Channel Country from its current arid state into something much wetter and more forgiving. All of those changes, and the lights persisted, and the knowledge of the lights persisted, and the protocols persisted. If the lights were a casual or trivial feature of the landscape, they would not have survived that level of cultural transmission. Things that survive 50,000 years of oral tradition in a living culture are things that matter. Things that have been repeatedly encountered and repeatedly relevant. Things that required protocols because the protocols were needed. The European written record is a footnote to a much longer document. The 100 years since the Min Hotel burned down is a small portion of the time that people have been walking through that country and seeing those lights and finding that no available explanation quite covered what they were looking at. We are somewhere in the middle of a very long story. The lights were there before we arrived to document them. They will be there after the current generation of researchers has moved on to other questions. The question of what they are is a question that the landscape has been posing, patiently, to everyone who crosses it in the dark. The answer, when it comes, will have been a long time in arriving. In the meantime, there is the road. There is the dark. There is the pale round light floating at head height, 50 meters away, moving at your speed, watching you cross one of the oldest landscapes on Earth. You are not the first to see it. You will not be the last. Drive safely.